1941. War had come to the world. Again. Like a sleeping dog, newly waked with its jackboots and gas masks, its trumpets and drum corps, its solemn promise of blood and famine and utter darkness. From the perfumed streets of Paris to small hamlets along the Rhine River, to the gambrel peaks of London to the thatched roofs of Braunston Town, from the golden cathedrals of Rome to the rolling hills of Tuscany, from the vaulted towers of New York City to the grassy plains of Iowa, the whole world shuddered in the wake of the metered steps of war. People dug bunkers in their backyards. They stored up food. They taught their children how to don gas masks. They erected air raid sirens and practiced evacuation drills. They collected metal to be melted down and formed into weapons of war. Electricity was rationed, gasoline was rationed, food was rationed. Everything was rationed in preparation for the marauding mouth of war. But in the sleepy little town of Sevierville, Tennessee, it was business as usual. Everything slow and steady and unperturbed. Once a day, the sun still climbed out from behind the mountains and ambled its way across the sky. And once a day, the Lima Prairie number 102 out of North Carolina came rolling into the depot near where the old Love Farm is now, and sturdy drovers and laborers unloaded the freight from the slow and easy boxcars onto mule-drawn bockboards to be hauled into hamlets and hollers where iron rails dared not go. The church bell of New Salem Baptist Church rang as it had each Lord's Day since African hands hand-hung it there in 1886. Flatboats drifted down the French Broad River from strange and exotic places like Asheville and Rocky Mount. Sevierville was always 1,000 miles away from everywhere, and whispered wars of war had a hard time climbing the rocky cliffs and forested hills surrounding her. News of the outside world came once in a while from a railway worker or flatboat drifter, but folks never really knew what to call gospel and what to call hyperbole. Folks took news with a grain of salt, as they say, and they ate it slow, pondering each morsel before swallowing. So the little town of Sevierville yawned itself awake every morning while the world prepared for war. Shops opened, streetlights dimmed down to nothing, barber poles turned, dogs crawled out from under porches and stretched and scratched at fleas or nothing, and Clemmie and George walked. Clemmie and George were brothers who lived over around Richardson's Cove, and they walked. Ask anyone who remembers, and they'll tell you, Clemmie and George were walkers. There was no telling where you might happen to see them. Along the narrow, winding ledges of Henrytown Road, down the straights and hills of Birds Creek Road, around the curves and dips of Pittman Center Road, they walked. For no reason. For any reason. For every reason. Sometimes they walked in tandem, sometimes single file, depending upon the size of the shoulder that bore them, but they always walked together. While boots of war marched across Europe, Clemmie and George shuffled about Sevier County in old shoes, slow and easy, like the boxcars that rolled into town every day, like as if time were not a thing, or even an idea, but a place, and like as if this one day might last forever. Often you'd see them carrying some thing or piece of a thing they had found along the side of the road or discarded in one of the public dumpsters. They gathered up these wayward objects like some circuit-walking missionaries, picking up these lost, busted, and broken things for greater service in some kingdom not yet seen by human eye. A bent bicycle wheel, a broken ironing board, a busted umbrella, a rusted kitchen sink, anything, everything. Clemmie and George never saw the sense in throwing anything away, and if you stopped by the little house where they lived, you'd find it full of the things they'd curated there. Broken things, busted things, rusted things. But it was never a mess there. They were not hoarders. Everything was organized. Everything had a place. Everything waited patiently there for resurrections. And there was a poetry to that. Clemmie and George were poets, but they did not know it, for none who knew dared tell them. For those who know, understand that the surest way to kill a poem is to call it a poem. One Saturday morning, Clemmie and George came shuffling down Main Street toward the courthouse lawn, carrying a metal washtub between them. There were a few vendors set up there along Court Avenue, peddling their wares or selling beans and corn and apples and chestnuts and other things from bushel baskets or tailgates of old trucks and fenders of old cars. There were old men on benches trading knives and telling lies and half-truths. There were young ladies from the women's college selling raffle tickets for cakes and pies. Politicians were politicking, shaking hands and patting babies. Small children were running about in their best go-town clothes, wide-eyed and frantic, like as if a trip to town were a trip to the moon. Everything was as it always was, and as it should have been. Like clockwork, as sure as shooting. This particular morning, though, there was something different. A table set up by the courthouse steps, an American flag waving there, and a man in an army uniform sitting on a folding chair behind a folding table with pamphlets spread out across it, talking to a group of young men who were standing about and looking at pamphlets and talking to each other and to the army man. Clemmie and George made their way over to see what was going on. The army man saw them and motioned them over. Clemmie and George went over. They sat the old wash tub on the ground beside the table. "How you boys this morning?" the army man said, and his voice was polished like a preacher's, like old Randolph Scott, crisp and clean, like easing out lines from some movie. Clemmie and George, never much for words, nodded in unison. "Y'all gonna sign up to go and fight Hitler?" the army man asked. "Who's Hitler?" Clemmie said. The army man studied Clemmie for a moment, like he thought he might be making a joke that didn't make any sense. Then he said, "Who's Hitler? What, you boys been living under a rock?" "No, sir," George said. "Over to Richardson's Cove." The army man studied them again. "Do they not have radios over in Richardson's Cove?" "We got 3 or 4 of them," Clemmie said. "Ain't none of them works, though. Ain't got nowhere to plug 'em into anyhow," George added. The army man said, "Do you boys not ever go to the picture show?" "No, sir," Clemmie said. "Me and George never did care to sit still for that long. And Mama always said them pictures wouldn't fit to watch," George added. The army man said, "Do you not ever read the newspaper?" "No, sir," Clemmie or George said. "Well, how do you know what's going on?" Clemmie looked at George. George looked at Clemmie. "Well," George said, "generally we just ask somebody." The army man reached a pamphlet to a young man standing there, but he did not take his eyes off the pair before him. "Hitler is fixing to try to take over the world," he said. "Say he is," Clemmie said. "Indeed he is," the army man continued. "And it's the God-given duty of every able-bodied, red-blooded American male to take up arms to see that he doesn't succeed. You see, this great land has—" And the army man cut into a speech so well rehearsed and rousing that it would have made old Franklin Roosevelt hang up his speechifying mantle. He spoke of the glory of war and the price of freedom. He spoke of sacrifice. He spoke of honor. And he used a lot of big, pretty words and hooked them all together like he was a preacher, and the invitational hymn was the Star-Spangled Banner playing softly behind him. And when he had finished, Clemmie and George asked the army man where to sign, and the army man showed them, and Clemmie and George signed their names. And just like that, Clemmie and George had joined the army. "Just let us go home and drop this old wash tub off, and we'll be ready to go," Clemmie said, after the signing was done. "Oh, no," the army man said. "You won't be leaving for another week. Be here at the courthouse next Monday, and a bus will be waiting here for you." "Say it will," George said. "Be sure to show up now," the army man said, folding the signed papers and putting them into a manila folder. "You boys are the property of the U.S. government now." "Say we are," Clemmie said. The army man looked at them sharply. "You are, and the U.S. government will come and find what belongs to it, with the full power of the law." "Well," George said, and Clemmie said, "We'll see you." And the two of them picked up again the metal wash tub and ambled away from the table. In the week that followed, the brothers told folks all about the county, how they were going over to France to fight Hitler. They told folks down at Charlie Blaylock's sawmill, down at the Quarles Brothers garage, down at Tebow Watson's barber shop, at Dave Householder's feed and grain store, at Ogle's store in Gatlinburg, at the Roberts Brothers blacksmith shop in Pigeon Forge. And the news spread like wildfire. Well, not exactly like wildfire. Nothing spread like wildfire in Sevier County, not in those days. Everything spread more like honey dripping off a spoon. Things took a while to get where they were going, but when they got there good. Everybody was talking about it. Old Clemmie and George going off to war. Biggest news to hit Sevier County since President Roosevelt come down in his big black limousine to run everybody out of the hills and make it a national park. Come that next Monday morning, there stood old Clemmie and George, bright and early on the courthouse lawn, waiting with about a half a dozen other boys to get on the bus. They were young boys, clean-shaved and dressed in their Sunday best, hats trimmed, shoes polished, fingernails clean, suitcases sitting at their feet. You would have thought they were going to meet the president and not going off to war. But young boys know nothing of war, and their childhood games make for poor tutors for that final bloody test that comes on the eve of manhood. And there was Clemmie and George with them, dressed in their overalls, old work boots, and crooked hats. They had a couple of old sheets tied into bindles at their sides, filled with their clothes and other things inside. The bus came and stopped, and the boys lined up and climbed aboard, and Clemmie and George climbed aboard with them. Their first bus ride. Their first trip anywhere their feet couldn't carry them. At about 8:30 that morning, the bus pulled up to the induction center over off Campbell Station Road in Knoxville. The door swung open, and the young boys spilled out on the sidewalk, and Clemmie and George did too. A tall man in a fancy army uniform met them as they settled on the sidewalk. He had a loud voice, and he barked out orders quick, told them to line up, and they did. Young feet stamping hurriedly on the sidewalk, new recruits eager to obey, clamoring over each other. All except Clemmie and George, who ambled into place as they had ambled into every place they had ever placed themselves. "Hurry, hurry, hurry!" the tall army man shouted, his voice stretched out and strained like it might come apart. Clemmie and George found their place in line, laid their little bindles on the sidewalk in front of them, as instructed. The tall army man began shouting out a whole litany of orders and directives. Then he went into a speech about defending freedom and doing one's duty and so forth, much like the other army man had done on the courthouse lawn, though now with much more fervor and volume. When he had finished, he asked if anyone had any questions. George raised his hand. "What?" the tall army man hissed. "Where's he at?" George said. "Where's who at?" "This Hitler feller," George said. The tall army man stepped closer. He glared at Clemmie and George, back and forth, like his eyes couldn't decide which one to stare down the hardest. The army man looked at him like as if it were a joke. "Hitler?" he said. "We've come over here to kill him," Clemmie said. "Just tell us where he's at and we'll get it done and get on back to the house." "We got things to do," George said. "He in that building yonder?" Clemmie asked, nodding toward a barracks in the distance. The army man stared back and forth from Clemmie to George, and then back to Clemmie again. He reached and touched the brim of his Smoky bear hat, pushed it up a bit, rubbed his forehead, pulled the hat back down into place. His face went from hard to almost soft, almost human, and he stepped forward a bit so as to not be heard by the other recruits. "Do you mean to tell me that you boys think—" He stopped, lowered his voice even more. "Boys, Hitler is in France." "Ain't we in France?" Clemmie said. "This here is Knoxville," the tall army man said, like as unto a child. "Say it is," George said. "Well, where's France at then?" Clemmie said. "Reckon we can get there and back before supper time? Me and George needs to get back by this evening." "Boys," the tall army said, his voice softening even more, "France is across the ocean." "Was that not the ocean we crossed back yonder?" George asked. "Back where?" the tall army man said. "Back yonder under that great big bridge we crossed," Clemmie said. The tall army man looked south, as if he might actually see the Henley Street Bridge. Then he looked back at Clemmie and George again. "You boys wait right here," he said. "I'll be right back." The bus rolled back into Sevierville late that afternoon. It stopped at the courthouse, and Clemmie and George climbed down and out of it with their makeshift bindles in their hands. The bus pulled off, and Clemmie and George started walking down Main Street toward the Gatlinburg Road. They came up on Cass Walker's store. Some old men were gathered about the front there, sitting on benches, whittling sticks and chewing tobacco. "What do you say there, boys?" one of the old men called. Clemmie and George nodded and ambled over closer to the gathering of men. "I thought you boys had went off to go fight Hitler," one of the other old men said. "We did go," George said. "You done whooped him?" another old man said. "Never did get to see him," Clemmie said. "We got there and the army man said they couldn't use us," George said. "He never did say how come." "Yep," Clemmie said. "Come back out from whatever it was he went into and had us a couple of bus tickets and told us we could go back home. So we come back home," George said. "Well," one of the old men said. "Well," George said. They took to walking again, down the Gatlinburg Road toward Newport Highway, carrying their bindles at their sides and hugging the shoulders and ditches. Directly, they came upon an old recliner chair laying sideways in the ditch. "Look yonder," Clemmie said. George nodded, and they situated their bindles across their shoulders and laid one hand apiece on the old chair and lifted it from the ditch and carried it like that, together, down Newport Highway toward Pittman Center Road and then Richardson's Cove Road, and then home.
If you enjoyed this story, please consider dropping a tip in the tip jar. If you like original stories set in Appalachia, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell for notification. Thank you kindly for your time.